You may wonder, you probably don't wonder. No, you don't wonder. So I shouldn't even say you may wonder. I'll just say, I'm going to tell you something that you could care less about. Mark Clifton and I were having a fascinating conversation about his clothes and how they're too big for him. I mean, we were waiting in between podcasts for one to download, and we got to start talking about his
Yes, my
weight
weight
loss,
loss.
Mark.
Yes.
Looking great. You've lost
Oh, thank you.
98 pounds.
No, thank you. 37 pounds in 3 months. So, yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
On the way to hell.
Yeah, feels good.
That is on the way. Sometimes I want our viewers and listeners just to know that there are conversations that happen in between the podcasts, and we want to give them behind the scenes. I'm not going to ask Mark to stand up and show us the fact that his clothes are too big for him, but there's a point.
They are. They're
that.
way too big.
And we will get to that point in this podcast series called Defining Success in a Church Revitalization. It's a 3-part series. Go back to the first one if you did not get to see or hear that one. That one is called 4 Myths of Church Revitalization Success. Some real nuggets in there. I mean, really some nuggets. And this one, why numerical growth is not always the best indicator of success. And you are listening and hearing and viewing a church growth guy who wrote the book of church growth. And I still say this is a reality. Defining success in a church revitalization, numerical growth is not always the best indicator of success. Let's jump into it, Mark. We got 5 of them, at least 5. We could probably add to this. At some points showing the decline rate or the slowing the decline rate. Let me get to talking well. At some point, slowing the decline rate is a success. You're not growing, you're declining less,
that is
right?
So right on true. You go to a church that has a history of decline, there's such momentum in that decline. It is like a boulder rolling down a hill. And man, before you start rolling that boulder up the hill, you got to slow the speed of its decline. And that, sometimes we say you got to just stop the bleeding. That's another kind of.
That's a good metaphor too.
We just before we get healthy, we got to stop the bleeding. We got to, and that can take time, Thom. That can take a year, 2, 3 years just to slow that decline. And in that time, sometimes people are looking at you going, how come your church isn't growing? Well, it is growing. You're making some real progress by slowing that decline and beginning to change the long-term trajectory of that church and beginning to change the systemic problems that have caused the decline. If the church is in long-term decline like that, there's a multitude of problems, and you just got to peel the onion back one layer at a time. You just got to deal with one layer and another layer, and it just takes time. But man, if you can slow that decline, you're making some huge progress, and just want to give you some good affirmation on that.
Let's look at a real life example. Let's say that you are leading a church that 5 years ago had 200 in average worship attendance. And today it has 100 in average worship attendance. The decline rate over 5 years is obviously 50%. It is half the size it used to be. Well, if your church 5 years from now or 3 years from now is 80, that may be a success.
That is a success.
Because the decline rate has
That
slowed.
is a success.
That is a success.
Yep, exactly right.
You're still declining, but we got all kind of metaphors in here. Stop the bleeding and your big pants and now the boulder. I like the boulder because the boulder's going the downhill and you're trying to push that thing back up to stop it. Yeah, I like that metaphor.
Yep.
Full of metaphors.
But the problem with that is you don't get a lot of affirmation. Well, the problem with that is, though, go back to the previous podcast, you don't get a lot of affirmation necessarily from your membership or your peers or others because your church isn't growing numerically. And yet you're really doing a good job just by slowing that decline rate. And that's why you really have to be aware of the hard work you're involved in and the long-term process of revitalization.
And let's do an ancillary part here on the decline rate. A lot of these churches that are in the midst or in need of revitalization have an older congregation. And so the death rate is going to be higher. And you can't stop a death rate.
No, I mean,
unless you have the spiritual gift of resurrection, you cannot.
I was with the pastor just the other day.
And you're losing people.
excuse me, he told me he was having more than one funeral a week. I mean, and this is not a large church. This is a church of a couple hundred people, but it's an older church. And yeah, you can't. You're going to lose through death, and not only death, but moving into care centers, moving into assisted living. Once they get to that age, they're going to begin. So that is a decline you can't stop. So if you see your decline slowing and that continues, then you're even doing better than you might think.
Exactly. Hey, to put it on the other point, son Jess Rayner is a pastor of the Church of Spring Hill, Tennessee. I've mentioned him several occasions. That's where I attend church, where I'm a member of the church. And that church is 7 years old. He has done one funeral in 7 years, and that was an out of town relative of a church member. That's it. That's that is a
That's
younger
a younger
church.
church.
His death rate is
Yeah.
zero. His death rate is zero in 7 years. So a lot of these churches don't have these young people when you go in there. They got a lot of older ones, and you're right. They're going to go into assisted living. They will die, and you just can't do anything about that. So that's a good point. Mark, second point. Why numerical growth is not always the best indicator of success. Most revitalization efforts, you are going to lose members just because you're
You're
revitalizing.
changing the culture. If you don't change the culture, it's going to continue to decline. If you don't deal with the systemic problems that brought them to this place, and many of those systemic problems have people attached to them.
Yes,
And if these
yes.
people aren't willing to change and follow the leadership of the Holy Spirit, they're going to leave. And I hate the term blessed departure. I think that's a cheap, tawdry term. I don't like that term. So I'm not going to say it's a blessed departure. But I think the Lord builds his church, and sometimes he also removes people that are hindering his church. And so I think at times if the Lord
Yes,
removes somebody, numerically you may go down for a bit, but health wise you may tremendously increase. And so you really want the Lord to build his church by bringing and removing those that need to be removed. And Dr. Rayner, I don't know of a single, maybe there are one out there. There's probably one out there. I can't think of a single revitalization I've been a part of that has not resulted in some people leaving and maybe leaving in not the best of attitudes. Because again, you're really making
exactly.
some definite changes, and these people, many of them, they're part of the problem, and they don't want to become part of the solution, and so they're going to have to leave. And so we talk about that in revitalization terms, that you have to be a pastor who has pastoral grit, who can deal with these things and not collapse and not cave in on yourself and not run for cover. But you just got to have some pastoral grit and realize this is just the cost of doing this kind of ministry.
We are complementing each other. Several weeks ago, I wrote an article on the seven traits of successful pastors 5 years from now. And of course, putting that word up, success, opened up all kind of can of worms. But I defined success, and I didn't define success by numerical growth. I said it may happen, but here are the other definitions. Well, one of the seven characteristics was grit. Some of these pastors just say, how did you stay at this church so long during this revitalization? Well, here's what I did. I went to sleep, and I woke up, and I got on my clothes, and I became a revitalization pastor. At the end of the day, I went to sleep, got up, and put on my clothes and became a revitalization. They just stuck
That's
with
right.
it.
That's so
So
true.
that grit is there.
Yep, it is.
Let's look at this third one. Let's look at this third one. The past is not always the measure for the present.
Ooh,
And that past can
ooh.
be, oh, I remember when Brother Jim was here. Oh, I remember when this place was full. Oh, I remember when. I mean, this ain't Alan Jackson saying remember when. This is people saying, you ain't measured up, dude.
Man, I tell you what, every dying church you go to, they've got a past where they had a really stellar experience sometime in their past. You're right. And they'll tell you the nursery was full, the choir loft was full, the hallways were full, the parking lot was full. They'll go through all of that. And then everything is judged by that point and moment in time. Moses only experienced the burning bush once, right? He didn't go around the rest of his life trying to find another burning bush. those things that
Oh,
happen.
come on, Mark. He had a cloud and a pillar, though.
We
Come
had a
on,
cloud and a
man.
pillar. That's true. And he parted the Red Sea and some other things like that. But he didn't keep looking for that same experience, is what I'm saying. I know that's
True.
really poor
Yes.
exegesis. But my point in that is that if God chose to do something in 1971 in that church, in that neighborhood, celebrate that. But don't use that as a marker whether God's going to do something. He may do something very different in 2023. This neighborhood's different than it was in 1971. So he's going to do something very different. It may be and will be, if we let him, just as powerful. It just may not look the same, and it may not be the same. And to say the only way we can know that we're successful is if we look like that black and white picture where the church was filled with kids in vacation Bible school. We got to get back to that when they had 150 kids here. No, not necessarily. You've got to do what God wants you to do in this neighborhood and in this church right now, and He'll define success as you do that. And you know, at Warnell Road in Kansas City, I had this picture. I put it out there. They took a picture on a Sunday where every seat was filled. There were probably 500 people or more in the sanctuary, 600 because it seated 600. Crammed to the max. There's no way that I went there. There were 18 people. There's no way the Lord could have done anything He wanted, but I just didn't feel like that's what He was going to do, and He didn't. But we grew to 150. Today it's about 200. Half the church could walk to church if they needed to. The neighborhood's being reached. It's planted 9 churches. It's raised up a tremendous number of leaders and pastors and that kind of thing. It's a very successful church. Is it packed like it was in 1962? No, because it's not the same neighborhood it was in 1962. And so, man, just got to let that go. You got to look at today. You cannot compare success based on what it used to be like in the past.
And many of our pastor friends, as they're leading these revitalizations, are hearing about the past as a person,
Oh yeah,
not just a packed house, but not just an event,
and
but it's Brother Bill, it's Brother Bob.
and sister Sue, who was Brother Bill's wife. We've never had a pastor's wife like her. I mean, she could cook so well, and she
Oh,
took care of
yeah,
the
yeah.
nursery, and she led the WMU, and she was so gracious. And listen, bless her heart, the longer Bill and Sue been dead, the more great they become. So that's that's
Well
true.
stated, well stated, well stated. You alluded to this. Let's unpack it a little bit. This fourth point: the size of the building is not always the point. In other words, you were talking about Warnell. So if you're not filling out the building, that's not necessarily the point anymore.
No, the building seated 610 people. We had 71 parking spots. I mean, I don't know what we'd do if we had that many people showed up anyway. I mean, back in the day, they rode the trolley. A lot of them walked. There's a streetcar right in front of the church.
Oh,
Yeah, that back in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s when the church had 600 people in it. But when I got there were 18, and it said the fire code occupancy above the door said 610. So that's how many that thing could seat. Well, if you grow to 150 and you seat 600, it still looks like 450 didn't show up that day. And frankly, if you're 150 people on a Sunday morning and it's a neighborhood church, man, you're like 90% of all Southern Baptist churches. That's pretty good. But if your sanctuary seats 600, you always feel like a failure. And people walk in and look at it and go, man, this place is 2/3 empty. It's like, who cares? I mean, it's like I
right.
told you, I've lost some weight. Thankful for that. Working hard at it. About 37, 40 pounds in the last 3 or 4 months, and my clothes don't fit. My clothes are too big now, and I'm actually healthier, but my clothes are too big. I don't think that's a poor analogy. I think sometimes a church can be healthier and leaner, but the building's too big, and so it doesn't look like it fits you anymore. And I remember when I drive to Warnell on Sunday mornings, I'd pass this little Episcopal church that could seat probably 200 people. It was a really smaller building. And I used to think, you know what? If that was the building we had, we would feel like we were really successful because we'd be pretty much filling that building up every Sunday. But no, I'm driving a few more blocks to this behemoth of
Hmm.
a huge building that seats 600. I got 150 in there, and it just feels empty. And that's just the building's too big for the church. And we often did that. Churches used to grow to a certain point, and then they built for 25% larger, and they never reached that. And then they began to decline. And then they had to spend too much money on keeping that building
Yep.
up. and the building became a huge maintenance issue. And that's a story we've all told over and over and over.
Hey, Mark, I want to go back to your comment. I want to unpack it just a little bit. It's not precisely on topic, but I want to unpack it. How many parking places did you have at Warnell?
71.
You remember?
Huh?
Okay. This is a reality I want to talk about to pastors that wonder how a church got that many people, like in his case, 600 with 71 parkers or two parking spots. There are two phenomena that we're seeing that are common. Number one is a lot of people could walk to church. It was a neighborhood church. And so you did not need the parking spot. Number two, if they did drive, you would often have 5 or 6 people in the same car. And now you may have a family of 5 and you have
Yeah.
5 cars
Yeah.
show up. Those are the two big things that have changed if your parking does not match your
Yep.
sanctuary.
Yep. That's true. Especially the,
I just wanted
yeah.
to.
And of course, like I said, in our case, we were right on the streetcar line. And so it stopped right in front of the church. And back then, everybody drove the streetcar. So you could ride to any place in Kansas City and get off our church. But no, I agree. Back then, there were a lot of families, right? And they had 2 and 3 kids, and they would pile them in the car, and you have 5 people, 6 people in one car. Yeah.
Pile in the Ford Falcon station wagon. That's what they would do. That's what we had, a 62 Ford Falcon station wagon.
What was it, the Ford Galaxy station wagon where the seat faced the back? The back seat would open up and you would be looking out the tailgate of the Galaxy station wagon.
I remember
those?
We keep showing our age in all of these, but I do remember. My first car was a 62 Falcon station wagon. I'm sure it's impossible, but it felt like it was a 1-cylinder and had no air conditioning.
You had a station wagon?
Anytime I get on a flight,
you had a station wagon as a teenager?
Oh, it was awful, Mark. It was awful. And it wasn't even my car. It was just that my parents decided not to trade that in when they got their 66 Falcon station wagon. And they said, you can have this, son. We're not going to buy you anything. I even went to the University of Alabama in my Falcon station wagon. It was really sad, Mark. It was just really,
my heart
really
breaks
sad.
For you at that
with
point.
with absolutely no air. I rode my bike. I wouldn't park my car near anybody. I rode my bike at college as much as I could.
Well, I had
I
had a 72. I had a 1970 Buick Skylark. That was okay. That was a pretty cool car. But if you remember, the gas prices went crazy in 78, 79 when the oil embargo, and I fell into this trap of marketing. And I made the worst automotive decision of my entire life. I actually bought a Renault Le Car. And so you remember Renault Le Cars? Do you remember that? You have to Google it. It was a little.
I remember Renault. I don't remember the model.
AMC bought Renault, and there was this little boxy car they sold in Europe for years, but they brought it to the United States. They called it the Le Car, and they painted it on the side of the car, Le Car. And there's a Seinfeld episode where George refers to having a Le Car, but I actually bought a Le Car. Look it up, Google it. It's we can put it in the show notes. It's very embarrassing, but I actually drove a. You saw it, so your Falcon station wagon has nothing compared to my red Le Car.
Oh, Mark. Okay, so. This was my Ford Falcon station wagon, except it was white.
Oh, that's okay. That'd be cool right now. The Le Car is still not cool right now. So, yeah, very nice.
This was not cool. I mean, I turned 16 in 71, and that's when I started driving a 62 Ford Falcon station wagon, and I drove it for the next 6 years. So yeah. I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to get into why that's poor, pitiful me, because many people don't have food. I can't complain about cars.
That's true.
So the size of the building is not the point. And just as a kind of a wrap up for all of this, numbers cannot measure everything. I mean, the numbers are just not the end all. And that's where we started, Mark, in episode one. And it's a good place to end on episode two. I know that that is something that you have affirmed again and again. And before we even get to defining success and what are some things that are successful, which will be episode three, just kind of wrap that up for us about
So
numbers simply cannot measure
when
everything.
I was the interim director of missions in rural North Missouri a couple of years ago, the largest church in that association might have been 150 or 200 people, but the vast majority of churches in this little rural association, 25 and 30 people, all of them bivocational pastors. I wanted to meet with every pastor in the association. So the only place to meet was Pizza Hut in the county seat town. So every evening I would go to Pizza Hut and I would have a new pastor, a different pastor show up. One night, this pastor, he's been a pastor of this church outside of this little town for about 20 years, 15, 20 years. He's a lineman. He works on utility linemen. His wife's a school teacher. Church runs about 30, okay? Nobody would write a book about it. It looks like it's stagnant, hasn't really grown in years. It's just one of those little country churches, runs 25 or 30. This guy's a bivocational pastor. He shows up at Pizza Hut in his work clothes. He's worked all day. He sits down. We begin to get our soda pops and we're getting ready to order our food. And he gets a phone call. He says, I got to take this. It's from my wife. Sure, no problem. She says, you know, that girl that's been in our church, her boyfriend beat her up and he's in jail at the county jail. And I'm
Mm.
going to pick her up right now and bring her home. She's going to stay with us tonight. You probably need to go to the jail and see him and see what you can do there. So this bivocational pastor had worked all day on the line outside as a lineman. Doesn't he says, Pastor, he told me, he said, I can't stay. I got to go. Didn't even have time to eat dinner, right? Gets up. He's going to the county jail, going to deal with some kid who got drunk and beat up his girlfriend, while his wife, who's taught school all day, is going to go pick up the girl and take her home to their house. Nobody knows about this couple. Their church isn't blowing off the doors with growth, but that story repeats itself day in and day out all across North
That's
America.
good.
And only eternity is going to reveal the real results of your ministry and your faithfulness. That's what success is to me. And there are men and women like that all across North America who are serving sacrificially that nobody knows about. And so I do get a little tired where we just brag on the ones that double in size. You know, this guy's working hard at this place. And when someone has a need, he and his wife are there. And that's about as successful in ministry as you can find.
That is a great way to put a bow on part two. You have been listening or watching, if you're on YouTube, to Defining Success in a Church Revitalization. It's been a three-part series. If you didn't pick up part one, go back to that, 4 myths of a church revitalization success. This one, we dealt with the hot button issue, why numerical growth is not always the best indicator of success. And then we're going to get to the positive thing. Part three, what are some successes? Maybe they can't be precisely measured, but are there some successes that are out there? Mark ended it well. We just saw one of those. It was a faithful pastor's wife serving without recognition, which kind of is pretty much Christ-like in what we're supposed to do. So stay tuned for part three of Defining Success in Church Revitalization when we come back to you. And the next recording on this, for most of you, it'll be next week. Thank you for watching on YouTube. Thank you for listening on your favorite podcast. Ratings, review, downloads, subscribe, whatever the right lingo is, wherever you are. Just let us know you're there, because this is sponsored by the North American Mission Board, and they make this ministry to you as a part of their ministry. We'll continue to look at this issue of defining success in a church revitalization when we wrap it up next week with those successes that cannot be measured but are successes. We'll see you then.